Hello and welcome to the Australian's Money Puzzle podcast. I'm James Kirby, the wealth editor at The Australian. Welcome aboard, everybody. I want to try something different this week. I want to try to talk to someone with a different perspective, much, much younger, starting in the market. I was looking for someone who was Gen Z, who could perhaps have the view of an investor or a renter or a potential first home buyer. And I thought, who would be good on this issue? And I know Sarah Petty. She writes, she's Real Estate Network across News Limited. She writes in particular for the Herald Sun, and she's joined me today in the studio. How are you, Sarah?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you. I'm going to hit you straight away with the first question. If you were lucky enough to have a deposit right now, and you were looking for your first property purchase, where would you start? I mean, obviously there's value out in the regions. We know that it's cheaper than the city. And then inside the city, houses are very dear. But if you could, where would you start? What do you reckon is the best opportunity just now?
Because I live in Melbourne,
Yeah.
I would definitely look within the city. And if I were to look around, I would say that the older style apartments, especially in Melbourne,
Okay.
they have much larger floor plans than new builds.
Oh, yeah.
They're a good investment opportunity as well because they're popular for both first home buyers and downsizers.
Right.
So
right.
that would probably be my first pick
Okay.
and a good stepping stone to get into the market.
When in the reporting, you follow all the auction patterns, I presume, and the different stories that are emerging out of the markets? You talk to the real estate agents all the time and brokers and everybody else like that?
Yeah, I do. I also speak to, first home buyers and tenants, and I get to speak to
What are the people? What's the mood on? We talk about, we're investors, so we're always thinking about the investor perspective on the show. But what's the mood among potential buyers and renters? I mean, do people accept it, or are people sort of angry at the lack of, especially for renting? Tell me about that scene. I mean, apparently it's quite brutal out there, often tougher to rent than buy.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, the rental market, especially in Victoria, which is where I report from, it's tight across the nation.
Yeah.
I mean, in Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane, vacancy rates are below 1%.
Yes.
So it's very, very difficult to find a rental. And
I don't think people understand. I mean, for you, that's probably, it's always been that, right?
Yeah.
To you, that's normal, right? 1%. That's not normal.
No.
I mean, normal is something like 3 to 7%, so that people are competing. So they don't have to compete now, right? So they got a 1% vacancy rate. So are property owners taking advantage of the situation, or is it just that if it's 1% vacancy rate, it's so impossible, it's going to be brutal anyway?
Well, the problem is that most homes are getting around 100 applications, and what happens? They go through a rental portal. And if you haven't filled out your application correctly, it can automatically get an X, and your application, despite being a great tenant, can get put to the bottom of the pile.
Right.
So in terms of finding a rental, you really need they can sort of cherry pick who they want to choose.
Yes.
So even in Victoria, for instance, you're allowed to have a pet.
Oh,
if you've got a big Great Dane or something like that, or a Rottweiler.
Yeah.
Even though you're allowed to have a pet.
I've got a Rottweiler. Put me to the top of the queue.
Not to say they're fabulous dogs, but they can make a subjective analysis of the kind of tenant you're going to be and the damage you could cause, and just say no, because they've got that option now at the moment.
So if there's 100 people going for a rental, and I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me, I often see what seems like a bigger crowd outside a rental than a house for sale. Mm-hmm. Have you come upon that?
Oh, yeah, there's queues. Anything subpar in the property market is likely to have a very long queue of people on its open day. Yeah. And even when I've called up, looking and seeing whether a property had a lot of interest, a lot of the time they already say, we've got about 100 people registered to come through today.
Yeah, that's... and I suppose no one can do anything about that, because you started by telling me there's a 1% vacancy rate, which means 99% of all property basically is rented. And so it's very difficult to grab a rental. So then I'm assuming, even though the law says you as the owner can't bid up the rental. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is how come rents aren't flying through the roof? Now, I know they're rising, but they're not. They didn't rise as quickly as say the lending rates that people had to pay. So there must be some sort of hold on it all the same, that people are clearly not bidding through the roof for rentals. The growth is solid and it's steady of how much people are charging for rent. But what's it like out there? What's actually happening? Do people bid up? Do they counter bid? Do people who are renting chuck in, look, we'll pay 10% more? Come across that?
They do. Well, actually, rental bidding, at least, again from Victoria, is you can offer more as a tenant, even though that's the housing statement has said they want to outlaw bids. You can still, it hasn't been legislated yet, so you can still offer more to get an edge and to put your application at the top of the pile.
Okay.
So that is happening still.
Surely, I imagine it's standard at this stage. If it's as competitive, if there's 100 people for every rental, then people must do that.
Yeah, and I even amongst my peers, I hear that all the time. In order, especially if you're 26 and you're living in a share house with say 3 other people, you're not necessarily going to be the most.
You're not going to look great on the form.
Favoured, yes.
Yeah, against the married couple who are both investment bankers with no dogs.
Exactly. Yeah, with no dogs, no children even, just working professionals.
So those people in share houses, who are the people who will first of all move into perhaps rental property and then become homeowners in the fullness of time. Do they take it as read then that when they go to rent something, they're going to have to play a different game than people like I had to play once upon a time, when I just basically, answered an ad, and I can't remember. I wasn't aware of how many people wanted to rent it because I would probably see the place by myself. Yeah. I'm talking about a long time ago. But the new normal means that the rents are so the rents are there's real competition with the rents. Have you come across anything in the way of bad behaviour or things to remember about that scene?
About getting into the rental market?
Yeah.
Bad behaviour. Well, I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure people get to their wits' end.
Yes.
And they want, they really are struggling. I haven't personally seen any bad behaviour, but I have seen a lot of people making really tough decisions in terms of getting rid of their pets. That's one.
Okay, right.
Yes, and actually the Lost Dogs Home just recently came out with some stats that they'd seen a rise of people giving up their pets just to get a rental.
Is that so?
Yeah, which is quite sad, obviously giving up your...
Didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, I had, I had thought of it. I hadn't thought about the fact that someone could already have a pet. And of course, if it's that competitive, obviously I can see how that would happen. So there's actually some if you like, audit proof of that from the Lost Dogs Home. That's really interesting. Now tell me, on the rentals then, in terms of people having to, when you get rejected, does that cost you in any way if you get rejected? Does that come up in any
If you get
file?
rejected from a rental, no. I think a lot of the time, if you haven't filled out your rental applications properly, it can be almost automatic in terms of that rejection.
But does that mean you filled out the form wrong, so you're rejected? But when you go around the next time to apply for the next one, is that relevant?
To my understanding, no, because most of the tenants that I've spoken to, they've applied.
Yeah.
60. They've put in 60, 70, 100 applications. Yeah. And they just keep cycling through. Yeah. So no, I think by the time that you're applying and you've had, say, 60 applications rejected, I would suggest getting some help from a rental advocate or asking, why are you getting rejected?
Yeah, right, okay. And it could be something as simple as you're not filling out the form right. In your frustration,
Genuinely.
my oh my, I wouldn't swap places with you guys. I really wouldn't for filling out forms, because in the end, the apartment is the apartment, right? So you just, it's like the apartment isn't any better because there's 100 people going for it. Yeah. Interesting. Now that's the renting side. Tell me about first home buyers. In terms of they're as a percentage of the market, the investors are coming back in now, and the growth in lending is all on the investor side at the moment. So it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that there are 3 types of buyer now. There is the roving investor who can buy anywhere and will look for the best place and the best return, and they could be sitting in Brisbane and they could buy in Perth. Yeah. And then there's a second, what they call the rentvestors, the most awkward term ever, but it's for people who can't buy their home, but they want to get into the market, so they buy. They're almost like reluctant investors, and they buy an investment property on the basis that they can negatively gear it, and someday they'll buy a house. And then at the bottom of the pile, it seems to me, is the owner-occupier. So, in terms of of owner-occupier, do you think it's got harder to buy a first home?
Definitely. And coming from my own personal experience,
Yeah.
you know, my partner and I, we're putting aside half our wage every week, and we've probably, over the last year, just been able to save enough money to cover our stamp duty.
Yeah, right.
So
right.
in terms of difficulty in saving,
Yeah.
and we're also renting, by the way. So
Of course, so you're renting, that money's going out the door, and you're saving.
Yeah.
Did you, in terms of grants,
Mm-hmm.
I expect you'd be eligible for some grants of some sort.
Yeah.
How do you even approach that? I get this question all the time on the show. People say, is there any one-stop shop where I can go and find out what grants I'm eligible for? How does someone even begin that process?
I've done quite a bit of reporting on those grants myself, so you can feel free to have a look up.
Yeah.
But yeah, going and having a look and just typing in, you know, first home buyers, depending on what state you live in, because every state offers different grants.
Yeah.
Most states offer some form of first home owners grant,
Right.
which can be anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000
Okay.
if you're looking to move into a new home or build your own home. So that's one.
So it's
side of
loaded.
things.
It's loaded towards the buyer who goes for the new home.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
we have such a supply issue across Australia at the moment,
Right.
which is contributing both to the rental crisis and
Yeah.
you know, first-home buyers being able to afford to buy a property.
Right.
But there's other schemes as well. There's shared equity schemes, which some
Yeah.
states do. New South Wales and Victoria do that, where the government acts almost like a guarantor
Yes.
and allows you to put down as little as 5%,
Okay.
which does help with that barrier to entry
Sure.
for many first-home buyers like myself
Yeah.
trying to save for
Okay.
that deposit.
Okay. Right. And how do you feel about sharing the ownership of a home with the government?
I think, again, it's dependent on how you want to approach the market. If you're really struggling and you just want to find your first home, your family home, for instance,
Yeah.
it's definitely a way to get into the market. If you're looking to purchase a property and use that as a stepping stone, as an investment to gain equity,
Yeah.
and then look in the future to buy a family home,
Yeah.
it might not be your best option because obviously you're not going to benefit as much from, you know, capital gains.
You have to share it.
Yeah, you have to share it. Exactly, you have to share
yeah.
it with the government.
Yeah. But
so
you're in. I suppose this is the whole thing is about
Exactly.
getting in, isn't it?
It is. It
Yeah.
is. It's
so
just
so you
dependent.
don't seem to have a problem with that rentvestor idea.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone came from another market, they would say, this is so upside down. You've got this generation who want to buy their first home. They can't afford their first home, but they're spending $500,000 on a tiny apartment in the hope that that in the future will underpin an investment in the first home. I mean, it does seem upside down from that perspective. But I imagine it's common with your age group. Do you know anyone who's done
Yeah.
it?
I know quite a few people that have done it actually,
Okay.
and even people that had a little bit of help from, you know, the bank of mum and
Yes,
dad, as they
yeah.
say. But when I was reporting on auctions a couple of weeks ago, a agent actually told me that he was seeing a growing generation of first home buyers
Yeah.
who were saving their money by living at home and
Right.
purchasing and putting down a deposit on a property,
Yep.
but they couldn't actually afford to pay for it once if they were to move in there. So
So they become investors,
they become rentvestors. Well,
accidental investors.
yeah.
Yeah. And would you try that yourself?
I don't know if I necessarily would. I'm fortunate enough to I live in a share house with 4 boys
Yeah.
at the moment, so I live in
Right.
quite a big share house.
Yeah.
And our rent is relatively cheaper than some of my mates.
Okay.
So I think grinding away
Yeah.
and saving is probably going to be what I do.
And I presume you're hoping that the actual house price stays modestly
Yeah.
ticking along as it is at the moment, as opposed to periods where it shoots.
Well, that's the concern, is that, you know, are we going to be able to save at the same rate as home prices rising?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to move back home at this stage in
Yeah.
my position as
Sure.
many people wouldn't be able to.
Sure.
Be a great option though.
Well, and there's two sides to that story.
Yeah.
There's two sides to that story. Everybody has to sort of be flexible. What about if someone left your share house?
Mhm.
If it's that competitive out there for rental, if someone leaves your share house and you've got a spot,
Yeah.
is that competition reflected when the spot comes up in a share house?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And
How many people might you reasonably expect if you put up an ad?
I would expect probably 100 responses. There's a website, there's a Facebook page called Fairy Floss in Melbourne.
Yes.
And every time I've looked on that
Yeah.
group,
Mm.
when anybody puts up a room for rent,
Yeah.
you'll see at least 100 comments.
And then how does the rest of the house come to the decision from the unwanted queue of applicants for the single spot?
I think it's a matter of almost, running your own open day in your own home.
Yeah.
and interviewing people.
Right.
And I actually experienced that when I moved to Brisbane. I had a few FaceTimes with the...
Because you were going to a city you didn't know and you were looking to share a house.
Exactly. When I moved to Brisbane in 2022,
Right.
I had a few FaceTime meetings
Yeah.
on the phone,
Yeah.
lots of questions asked, proper
Okay.
interview process. So
Yeah.
it's very, very competitive, that's for sure.
Gosh, it's competitive and arduous for what many people would have thought was a routine.
Exactly.
But this is the difference between your generation and mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how long it'll last. And there's something, you're a property reporter, you see the prices, you see the auctions. Do you see anything that suggests this is going to improve or ease?
Look, I personally don't. Obviously, I'm, 38 hours a week looking at statistics and interviewing tenants and interviewing first-home buyers, and it's not looking that promising. We've had a very rapid population growth,
Yes.
and a dwindling supply added to the market. So it's not looking great. And it's not, and from a personal perspective, it's not a great outlook in terms of being able to purchase a property. I know a lot of my friends are working, 2 jobs just to put that extra bit of money away. And it's...
Are you working on the basis that rates are going to come down?
I think that rates will come down. I think they'll come down at least once, maybe...
Okay.
Yeah, towards the end of this year.
Right. So that is and that is the expectation. Though it's starting to move out, isn't it? I mean, it's starting. It was almost seen as for sure, and now it's like, well, hopefully by Christmas or November, December, which is very late. You're nearly into next year.
Absolutely.
By the time, certainly some of the economists are suggesting.
Well, and I think as well, the minute that there's a rate when decrease.
Yes.
That's potentially going to open the floodgates for a lot of first-home buyers.
Yeah.
And build a lot more confidence. And confidence has already come back into the market.
Right.
Buyer sentiment's already increased, as seen in auction rates and when I've covered the auctions as well. So it'll be very interesting to see what will happen when that rate does come down.
Yes.
And whether or not Michelle Bullock wants to actually be the one that does that.
Yeah, because people, as you say, most people who aren't watching it every day like you and me will actually wait to see the rate come down. Then they'll respond. I want to ask you something quickly about HEX. Did you, HEX, I presume you have a HEX bill like everybody else. 23,000 is the average HEX bill. It's used by the banks in assessing loan serviceability. Do you think, first of all, that's fair, and should it be in there at all? They're hoping that some HEX changes might be made in the budget.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see. I would love that personally. I don't know. It's a funny one because everything is assessed when it comes to your borrowing capacity.
Yeah.
Anything from your HEX bill to your expenses, how much takeout you're ordering.
Yeah, but it's not the same thing. Like your takeout, how many takeaways you get per month, and your HEX bill are not the same thing. I mean, your credit card from the nightclub on Saturday night is not the same as your student debt, is it?
It's true. It's true. I think it. I think, it is. I think it's also, to be honest, for people my age, it's something that is taken out quietly and in our taxes and isn't really thought about because we already know that a lot of us have huge HEX debts. I think it does make a difference. I actually interviewed somebody recently who's decided she was just buying a property herself.
Yeah.
And she was doing everything that she could to improve her borrowing capacity. She only had a little bit left of her HEX debt to pay off.
Oh, yes.
And she was advised to just try and pay it off.
Yeah.
So spending a few years saving very diligently, she decided to take some of that savings out, pay off her HECS debt because it put her in better stead to...
Because she could borrow more at the bank.
Because she could borrow more at the bank.
Isn't that interesting?
It's a case-by-case scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're 100 grand in debt in terms of your HECS debt, it's probably... You're better off getting into the property market sooner rather than later and building up that equity and potentially changing your property goals as opposed to trying to, spend years trying to pay off your HECS debt.
Or just letting it roll along.
Or letting it roll along.
Being inflation indexed all the time. It's a really good point. And it's very, very interesting observation. Thanks very much for that, Sarah. I imagine it's something that's... we did a HECS special just last week. And it came up. And just the background there, folks, if you've missed that show, is that it used to be counted by the banks. It was introduced by APRA a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, into the servicing requirements. So the banks now add your HECS bill. And if your HECS bill, the average HECS bill is 23,000. But that's an average, right? So you'd have people... Did you say you knew someone with 100,000 HECS debt?
Yeah, I know people that have been capped out, especially...
100,000?
Oh, yeah, because they're...
What do they do?
Well, studying postgrad law and...
Yeah, right.
A lot of people who have reached their limit for their HECS debt and... Yeah, that's a...
My, oh my. So that's a whole new ball game which is emerging in the market. And I think it's going to affect property patterns, rentals, and how people look at property long time. Terrific. We'll take a break and we'll be back with a few questions. Hello, welcome back to the Australians Money Puzzle podcast. I'm James Kirby, wealth editor at The Australian, talking to Sarah Petty, who is the real estate reporter on the Herald Sun, works for the News Corp Real Estate Network. There is a big gang of you there covering property intensely every moment of the day. And obviously I watch these guys very carefully because they inform me as to what's going on the ground. And Sarah is a reporter on the ground in Melbourne for the Herald Sun and very much across the issues from a different perspective, as I say, from a different perspective demographically. Gen Z, did you say? Gen Z, yes. Folks. And that is... an element of the market that becomes more and more important, of course. Okay, first question from Richard. We own a retail space. I'll assume that's a shop. We own a retail space in New South Wales, and it is probably our best performing real estate asset. We are considering buying an office or retail space in Melbourne as our kids live there. We travel there occasionally. Is office space as an investment recovering, and how is it looking compared to retail? Whoa, Richard, thank you for the question. This is never advice, this is information. I'd be very slow to mix up those two categories, retail and office. Office is a very, very tough area at the moment. We're going through this extraordinary period of work from home, and I imagine, again, your demographic and my demographic are different on this. I still think work from home is an oddity. I still think it's the funniest thing on earth that I'm at home on a Thursday afternoon. I never was, ever.
Well, I've never even I've always split my time since I started full-time working.
Since you started full-time, well, yeah, exactly. And you think that's the norm, and I don't. Interestingly, when it comes to office space, then there are vacancy rates of 30% in office districts in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, 10% would be a big problem traditionally. 20% you're into like deep recession. So I don't know why anyone would go near office really at the moment, unless it was a very, very, very long-term play. Perhaps a shop of the right thing in the right place, perhaps, of course.
I tend to agree. I think offices are still just not back to what
they're not, and they may never come back to where they are, despite efforts from. And it's interesting about industry getting people back to work. IT has no plans to get people back to work. They're not asking for it at all. And I think that gives them a competitive edge compared to conventional industries. So, Richard, all I would say is if our hunch would certainly be that retail space where you have already built an expertise and had good fortune, I would see no reason why you should diverge from that particular path. But that is not advice, it's information. Natasha, what have you got against the First Home Super Saver scheme? We have been using it and it works for us. Also, can I ask if you believe super should be allowed for the first home deposit? If that had been allowed, we would obviously have preferred such a scheme. Hey, okay, all right. Well, the First Home Super Saver scheme, You mentioned a few schemes. You never mentioned the First Home Super Scheme. Do you know anyone who uses it?
I don't know anybody that uses it personally. I think it scares me even touching your nest egg, especially when everything's so expensive now, and getting into the property market is. Yeah, I think keeping your nest egg safe is probably. I guess that's what I'll personally be doing.
So you come from the school that super is super and investment property is investment property.
Well, that's how I was.
And never the twain shall meet.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a bit of a risky. However, everybody has different goals. Everyone wants to do things differently.
Yeah.
Could be the thing that gets you into the market, I guess.
Well, this is it. Look, Natasha, I have nothing against the First Home Super Saver scheme, except that it is an incredibly awkward, complex scheme that strikes me as more trouble than it's worth for the majority of people. And that's been both my experience and what I hear and what I read and what I've been told on this show, and also in my work on the Australian and in the market more widely. It's also the least popular of all the schemes, which I suppose tells us something. And I wouldn't mix it up with super. I wouldn't mix it up directly with can you use super, because it's about using contributions that might have gone in either direction. The issue of whether you should be allowed to use super for a home deposit. Well, I have to say, originally I was very much of the opinion that never the twain shall meet, and super policy should be solved with super problems should be solved with super, etc. I have to say I've drifted on that, and I've come across so many episodes where people say it's so much more important to have a home. And as I kind of more and more understand the tax system, the entire system is loaded for the homeowner. And if you aren't in that, then you get the tax system loaded against you. So I am not, in principle, I would actually like to see some suggestions around using super for home deposit, especially now that we're moving up where the SGC is running so high now. You know, it's for people who thought it was 3 or 4 percent, it's now up at 11 and 12%. So it's a very different thing. And whether you actually need that much is another debate for another day, which we won't go into here. Okay, David, on the issue of how much you can contribute to super using carry forward plans, go to the MyGov and link the ATO to your account, and the amount you can contribute, if you are eligible, is listed under the superannuation tab at the top of the page under information. Thank you, David. I completely agree with you, David. That's really good. I have my MyGov and my ATO all linked. I have my SMSF super account in there, and I can see at a glance what the ATO sees of me, which I find very useful. And it's very useful in terms of, and one other thing I might mention, folks, is that the ATO, there's one good thing about them. They're still pretty good at calling. They have helplines, and you can call, and there are people there, and they will talk to you, which is such a rare thing these days. So, for what it's worth, the ATO are good at answering, having actual humans answering the phone who know what they're talking about. You know how rare that is. All right, we'll take a break. Back in a moment. Hello, welcome back to the Australians Money Puzzle podcast. James Kirby with Sarah Petty from the Herald Sun. We're talking real estate. We're talking the issues, particularly for younger people getting into the market as a renter, as a home buyer, as a long-term investor. Our final question is from Andrew. The general advice for someone in their 30s seems to be to pay down the mortgage or contribute more into super. Beyond that, if someone wished to invest in shares on the ASX, what would be the pros and cons of investing in dividend stocks from a yearly tax return? Very simple, Andrew. All things being equal, on a normal year on the market, the Australian share market pays a dividend yield of about 4.5%. So you could expect for every $1,000 you put in the market, assuming not much happened during the year and the market ended up, even if the market ended up at the end of the year more or less where it was at the start, you would still get 4.5% income from Australian shares. And if they're fully franked, you get in your pocket, you get even better than that, grossed up as they call it. And if you were retired, it's really good because it really kicks in because you're a zero taxpayer. So it would be about a dividend policy is about creating income. Whether you need income in your 30s is the thing. And certainly, it depends on which way you're doing it. If it's inside your super fund, for instance, in your 30s, I think you would still be concentrating on growing the amount you have rather than the amount of income you can produce each year. So as a general rule, the older you are, the more you focus on income, the more you would focus on the dividends from your shares. If for someone who's paying down their mortgage and has good super and is tipping into super all the time, I think you should be buying growth shares because you got a long way to go.
I'll take that advice myself.
You can take that as good information.
Good information.
Good information. Well, that was great, Sarah. Thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you. Lovely to have you on the podcast. That was Sarah Petty from the Herald Sun, and she is a real estate reporter on the News Network. I'm James Kirby. Thank you very much for listening to the show. Let's have some more questions. It's really funny how it swings. For a while there, I was getting too many property questions. Now I'm not getting enough property questions. We're getting questions on everything else under the sun, so keep them rolling. The email is themoneypuzzle@theaustralian.com.au. Talk to you soon.